It has been about 2.5 years, which in the context of long-term Wayland protocols isn't actually that long. About 4.5 if you want to include the historical issues. 3 separate protocols. Countless hours spent, close to 1,000 interactions just across these threads, let alone any discussions that might have happened in person, on Matrix, in forums, in private messages, or anywhere else they might happen. Application developers asking Wayland to just listen to real-world use cases that they have that they can fulfill on literally every other environment that is not based on Wayland. The main thread with over 600 interactions at one point getting locked, which then after I covered it getting locked, got locked again with them trying to blame me for getting it locked, even though I was probably the last person to talk about this happening. But over the years and over the past couple of months since that happened, it has been progressively getting worked on, issues have been ironed out, issues have been hashed out, there have been lots and lots of conversations trying to sort of theoretically analyze every possible situation in which this protocol can actually get used. And now I don't know how it's happened. I hereby would like to formally request the 2 weeks review period for inclusion of this protocol into the experimental track to start. I don't see any knacks or waits here, and the 2-week review period has passed. After checking with governance, I agree this new experimental protocol can be merged. From Matthias Klump, who has been leading the charge here, thank you. If you don't know what this protocol is, basically, it's a way to allow applications to position their own windows. Now, for most applications, they're not going to use this, they're not going to want this, and there's no real good reason for them to even have it. However, there are specific kinds of multi-window applications. For example, GIMP has a multi-window mode. We can have the toolbar and all of this other stuff separated from the main canvas window. It's not like the main thing that is used for GIMP anymore, but it is a thing that does exist. Or you can have a multi-window situation where you have most of your windows on one monitor and then another window on another monitor, which is very common when you are dealing with scientific applications. There are some other use cases like a multi-client zone where you can have all of the windows grouped together of that specific application and then move that group of windows together as a collection of those windows, and also an infinite scrolling case. If you were to have a scrolling environment that wasn't scrolling tiling, it was scrolling floating. I don't know of any compositors that are like that, but in some sense, like a VR compositor is kinda like that. This is something that can be done on Windows, on macOS, on X11, but it couldn't be done on Wayland. This is something which isn't as popular of a way to build an application nowadays, but is still a perfectly valid model to build an application, and there are applications that people still use today, like KiCad, like some scientific applications, that still require this to be here. If it's not here, all of the windows would just be stacked on top of each other, and then you'd have to like go and rearrange them every time you open the window, or you kind of hack it with window rules, which is annoying and not something that just works. Also, there's really stupid but cool pieces of software like Window Kill, which probably wouldn't be a good reason to Wayland developers, but is still a really cool application nonetheless, and I'm happy that things like this are actually possible. Again, you wouldn't be able to use this as a justification for why it should be added, but it's also a thing you can do. With this going to review, and then with this being merged, what does this actually mean for the protocol? Does this fix everything? Is the fight now over? No. No, there's still a lot to do here, but first, let's go over why he wanted to go through the review period in the first place, even though it wasn't really going to solve anything. The protocol fulfills all requirements for inclusion outlined in the government's document. I have talked to people who provided feedback and implementations, and no objections to going this route were raised. So, this is true. However, okay, let's just be clear. Were no objections raised because everybody else gave up and you outlasted them, or were no objections raised because there were no objections? Because in the past couple of months, it's basically just been Matthias and a couple other people who haven't really been that active in the prior parts of the protocol. Daniel Stone is here, but most other people, not so much, right? For a long time, you had a lot of KDE people in here, a lot of GNOME people, some Cosmic people, but now it's basically just Matthias. So, honestly, part of my thought here is everybody else just gave up and were like, fine, just do it. This is not worth our time to argue about this anymore. I commit to maintaining the protocol while it is in experimental and might create a new draft merge request that moves it to staging/ext as a place to collect feedback if that is desired. Oh, I'm so excited to see the discussion with a fourth version of this protocol being opened. I can only imagine that this is going to go perfectly smoothly with no issues at all. This is the rationale for going experimental. Discussions are currently stuck on assumptions, how many people may or may not use the protocol, and potential issues that may or may not be real. Most of the feedback is this. It's like, oh, but how many applications are actually going to use this protocol? How many people are actually using those applications? How many people are affected by not having this protocol? And then, oh, but what if this potential malware uses the protocol to do this thing, and then, it does this other thing, and that looks really bad? But no one is willing to go and say, okay, but are these problems that exist in the real world, or are these theoreticals that I can come up with in a vacuum? Honestly, my favorite one is, oh, if an application can position itself, it could position itself over a password dialog and then look like the password dialog, which is true if Wayland applications could see each other, which they can't. So no, that's unless it's gonna look like a password prompt that appears on your screen. And sure, yeah, okay, maybe it could do something, and it could already do that anyway, right? An application can spawn full screen, so that's not even a real concern. But yeah, maybe that could happen. Maybe. But there are so many easier ways to do things maliciously that I don't think that's a concern. At this point, only experimentation in the real world can give us actual reliable data, and it will move discussions out of the thought experiment space and into the space of real application usage. That should make conversations a lot more productive too. The other problem is, whilst these issues are being brought up, they get rehashed and rehashed and rehashed and rehashed, because there's not actually any real-world data, at least on Wayland. There's real-world data on X11, but none on Wayland. So nobody even has anything to base their arguments on. It's just thinking about what maybe could possibly happen. Questions of how Toolkit abstract the zones interface can only be answered in the real world, and auto-tiling compositors would need a true reference to experiment with whether this protocol might work for them as well, and suggest changes if needed. I can tell you right now, you actually don't need real-world data, because, actually no, we have real-world data, okay? It's called X11. The real-world data is, you don't care about where the windows want to be placed in a tiler, because it's a tiler, and anybody using a tiler expects the windows to be tiled, right? This is just a non-issue. You don't know how many comments in this thread brought up tiling. They're like, oh, but what is Sway gonna do about this? Nothing. Because anyone using a tiler expects the windows to be in a tile. They don't care what the window wants to do. They want it to tile. This is a well-defined problem space, and every time I saw that argument being brought up, I'm just like, You know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. We all know what you're doing. It was a non-issue from the start. Everybody knows this. One space where I do think there is some reasonable discussion to be had is a VR compositor. Do you want all of the windows for an application to be grouped together? Because they can't be explicitly placed in that coordinate space because it's VR and the coordinate space is going to be different from what you have in a desktop environment like this, in a regular desktop system. That I think is worth discussing, but I don't remember if that was even brought up in the conversation. Being an experimental permits toolkits to actually merge implementations behind a feature flag, which makes testing the protocol way easier. So a bunch of environments, a bunch of toolkits did have, experimental branches, some of them third-party, some of them plugins, other things like that. But there's this implied, hey, don't move ahead with a protocol until it's agreed upon in upstream, even though there's nothing actually stopping you from doing so. So some of these plugins were actually already just going ahead and doing it, and that was kind of getting on the nerves of some of the people in this thread. Now that it's an experimental, there is no reason to not go ahead and do so. And here's the fun thing about being experimental. As soon as those things get merged, you're not gonna stop them. It's not gonna happen. For the people that don't like this protocol, letting this get into experimental, you don't know what you've unleashed. There is so much development force behind this simple problem, and it shouldn't have been a problem that spent this long. This is now out of your hands. It was already getting out of your hands already. It was being implemented outside of your consent. Now it truly is out of your hands. And what's probably going to happen is the same thing that happened with the input protocol for like on-screen keyboards, where the early version got merged and there's like 2 or so others after that. But now they actually need to implement support for each version of the protocol because people wanted something and then took the first thing they got, even though it wasn't great. And then other things came down the line, but then different environments have a mishmash of what they actually support. But speaking of existing support, there is this Kwin Protocol EXT zone support. This created a couple of months ago. It is still being worked on. It is being worked on by some KDE developers. It's actually in their official automotive repo. So even though there is some disagreement in KDE about bringing this in, KDE is generally pretty good at just, even if they don't necessarily like something, if there is enough user force behind it, enough development effort behind it, usually they will bring it in anyway. That's where I'm expecting this to go. It mainly just exists right now for a plugin in the automotive space because the automotive space doesn't care about your politics in the Wayland protocols repo. They care about creating software that they want to create, and KDE is being sponsored by Mercedes, so they kind of have to work with them, at least on the automotive front. Will this ever make its way into the desktop side as a core part of KDE? I hope so, but we still have to wait and see. And we also have this development branch of SDL, which hasn't been merged just yet, but is still actively being worked on. And speaking of those, there are already multiple implementations of this protocol in plugins and compositors, all using different snapshots of it. By going with the experimental track, we create a single source of truth, and Wayland Protocols becomes the reference for this protocol while it is being worked on. It's a convenient way to share some XML between implementations. Yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about before, where if you don't standardize things, the community outside of Wayland is going to standardize things for you. And when that happens, usually it doesn't become a standard, it becomes a bunch of mishmashed, sort of half standards, and it's a mess. So saying this is experimental, this is the baseline, is going to mostly fix that problem. I expect the protocol to receive some tweaks while it is an experimental, and hopefully it will at some point in the future be ready to move to staging, or at the very least provide useful data on this approach while being an experiment. What's going to happen is, now that it's experimental, it's going to be merged into things, it's going to have plugins created, and yeah, this is the final version of the protocol that's ever going to be used until you make a v2, and then input situation all over again. Yeah. Even though that's definitely going to happen, where does this actually put us in, like, core Wayland stuff? Basically, where we already were, just a little bit more positive than before. This change by itself doesn't really mean anything, doesn't really change anything, but as I've been saying, it does act as this incentive, as this go-ahead to actually implement the protocol. So even if there is some, like, questioning of whether this should or shouldn't be done, now there's at least that baseline there to say, okay, this is something we can at least play around with to see if this does really work. But the real reason why it's not really changing anything just yet is there was a lot of argument from basically every environment. This isn't a situation where KDE agreed with it, but GNOME was holding things back, or Cosmic agreed with it, but KDE was holding things back, if that ever happened at some point in the future. This is a situation where GNOME people, KDE people, Cosmic people, WRoots people, I don't think there's any mere people in the thread, all had some level of issue with the protocol, either with the protocol existing or with some direction the protocol was going, with some use case the protocol was trying to solve that maybe they didn't think should have been solved. At the same time, there wasn't a universal opinion in most of these projects, so there were people in there that also did agree with it, that actually are working on it, as we saw from, you know, the KDE work for this plugin here. This is an official plugin in their repos. If I'm being totally honest, this is the way I expect things to pan out. GTK probably is not going to implement it because, from what I can see, no one in GNOME really cares about this feature. It's not going to be something that gets brought into the GNOME desktop. Qt and KDE, I think when it comes to the Qt side, they're probably going to be interested in it for the sake of cross-platform compatibility. If a user makes an application on Windows, they want it to work properly on Linux, and it works properly on X11, but it currently doesn't work properly on Wayland. So just for the sake of that, I can see it being implemented. And as I said before, when it comes to KDE, usually if there's some interest in making something happen, it actually gets implemented. Even if there's some, like, argument in the project about whether it should be done, in most cases, KDE is going to do things that users actually want. When it comes to the ICE toolkit, look, I have no idea what ICE is going to do. I don't even know why Cosmic built off of ICE. ICE is like a weird personal toolkit of the developer, so who knows what they're going to do. As for Cosmic, they do make a lot of similar changes to KDE, and do make a lot of these changes which are very user-friendly changes. There are people in System 76, in the Cosmic environment, that don't like this protocol. But if it gets brought into KDE, and if it works well there, I would expect to see them to also follow along. Also, this might change the equation a bit. There is some interest in doing multi-window web applications from Chromium and W3C. So, depending on how that happens, and depending on adoption of that, that's going to kind of act as a forced incentive, because otherwise you're going to have applications just not working properly in GNOME. As for other things like Mir tends to adopt everything because it's just a library to build other things. WRoots and Simon Sir, Simon's generally been pretty against this protocol, but also he's been against a lot of protocols and then eventually said, okay, I'm just going to implement this into WRoots, even if it's not being used in Sway. So we'll see what happens there. As for Hyperland, with it being a tiling environment, look, I don't know what's going to happen there. But also, Hyperland has a bunch of different windowing modes, so at some point I wouldn't be surprised if they just have some, like, competitive floating environment. If that happens, I could see it being implemented. Or for the sake of floating window rules, right? So if the window is set to floating on launch, then it will make use of the protocol. considering how much random stuff Vaxthru does with Hyperland, I could see it happening. But what do you think? Where do you think this is going to go? Do you think we're actually going to see any implementations in the environments? I have my doubts. Okay? As much as I think KDE might eventually hop on board, I have my doubts. And then when there's a new merge request for a version 2, well, we'll see how that goes. So, if you like the video, go like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Sally Therapy, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and you know what? I still love this saga.
Something like this.